Christian hope is resurrection. Christian hope is what we see revealed on Easter Day. We're not optimists or escapists. We're not people who believe in progress or in an evacuation. We are the people who believe that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. Now pause with me for a moment and just think about the resurrection. What we see in the resurrection is Jesus' material body being brought through death in such a way that it is transformed, redeemed, glorified. Our words kind of fail when we're talking about this. Remember that the disciples on Easter morning don't find a vacated body. They don't find a shell of Jesus' old flesh, and then Jesus shows up and says, hey, I've got the human suit 2.0. They don't find a vacated body, they find an empty tomb. They find a Jesus whose body has wounds on it, and yet a body that is somehow able to appear in rooms that are locked, doors where the disciples are hiding behind. And so resurrection helps us understand this is not an escape from the material world, but rather the redemption of it. But we also understand that resurrection means that death has occurred. And so the secular eschatology of progress is not at all what resurrection is. See, resurrection does not emerge from possibilities which are latent in a corpse. It doesn't arise from potential. It comes from the outside. It is not a voice from within, but a voice from beyond that summons the dead to life. And so Christian hope is not progress or escape. It is resurrection. The word eschatology, as I've hinted at already in this first session, comes from this Greek word that refers to last. And so oftentimes people say, well, it's the study of last things. But there's this other Greek word, telos, that makes us think of the goal. And I would like to suggest for us as you're going through this course that biblical eschatology may be defined as the belief about the goal. A belief about the goal that God as the creator has in mind for his creation and the destination that God as redeemer will bring about for his creation in the end. It's possible that some of our popular evangelical eschatology of escapism comes from a distortion, maybe a misreading of some of Augustine's work. Augustine's one of the great theological fathers of church history, and yet there's some aspects of his thought that people have described as a kind of Neoplatonism, a new version of Plato's view of the world, which was that the material world is just sort of the shadow of the real thing, and the real thing is somewhat spiritual. And the reason they say this is because in Augustine he focuses so much on the redemption of the soul and not much about the redemption of the cosmos, of creation itself. And so this sort of then led, and these are broad strokes of church history here, but this sort of led to medieval Christianity, a focus on the redemption of the individual, and therefore a focus on the soul departing to heaven. This gets further distorted in the late 1800s by some teaching that develops by a man named Darby, who began to read into the scriptures this idea of a rapture, of some being caught up and others being left behind. And really it was sort of a misreading of many of the texts in the New Testament. But then that rapture sort of idea that one day some people are just going to be airlifted out of here and others left behind was coupled with a kind of apocalypticism. And there were many teachers, Moody and some others in the American context, that began to sort of say the world is coming to an end, the earth, planet Earth is a sinking ship and we need out of here. And it kind of fueled evangelism with a bit of an end times fervor. And even though theologians and scholars and seminaries have taught and trained us to sort of recover the vision of hope in the New Testament and even the hope of early Christians, which we will cover in the very next session, even though they've done all of this retrieval work, at the popular level, there's still this imagination that we have that there's a gloom and doom end of the world, but some people will be raptured out of here, and in the end, as long as we have our passport stamped for heaven, we're going to be okay. So when I began doing research for this work about how hope is experienced and expressed in contemporary worship songs and services, I needed to begin by surveying worship leaders about what they would say is true about Christian hope. So with the partnership with Integrity Music, I actually sent out a survey to 25,000 worship leaders and had about 1,000 respond. And I gave them 4 different statements. And I didn't, sort of tip my hand to say this one's the right one or whatever, but the statements were these. 1, God will set it right one day. And the other one was, God will explain it to me one day. And the third one was, God will get me out of here one day. And the fourth one was, God will make it up to me one day. And then I sorted these answers on the back end in my own work into categories of evangelical hope. 1, the first one, that God would set it right, is we might call that new creation. The other one, that God will explain it to me, well, that's explanation. God's going to get me out of here, well, that's evacuation. God's going to make it up to me, well, that's compensation. And as I sorted it in these categories and combed through the responses from these worship leaders, a couple of observations came to the surface. The first is, no one's actually looking for God to make it up to them. That's not the primary view of Christian hope. And secondly, evangelicals claim to find hope most in God's redemptive work of new creation. So we sort of know, yeah, that's the one I should say, that God will set it right one day. But I also discovered, and this is because the 2 churches that I focused on, one was Presbyterian, the other was a non-denominational charismatic church. So I sliced out some of these responses by denomination, and I discovered that Presbyterians were more likely to believe in a new creation than the larger group. And we'll explore some of these reasons. It could be because of the creedal, liturgical confessions that are part of worship for Presbyterians. But I also discovered that, as a corollary, charismatics were more likely to believe in evacuation than the larger group. And that could be a kind of distorted emphasis on the spiritual, again, as opposed to the material and the physical. And so we recognize right up front that we've got some work to do. If worship is about hope, and if we sing because we're people of hope, we've got to make sure that our hope is indeed the hope of resurrection that Christians have cherished for centuries.